for today.
By the host or a participant.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Shirley. Good morning, Dunbarton. It's a real thrill to be invited to introduce our son. I'm going to make this quick because he has a lot to say. More than I have to say. Born in DC, we set off for Honduras when he was 3 years old. His greatest accomplishment up to that time was playing a sheep in a Dunbarton Christmas pageant. The next year, he was promoted to become a shepherd. When we came back to DC, he enrolled in Oyster Elementary School, which was a bilingual school, because his parents wanted the kids to grow up in a diverse environment, diverse neighborhood. Mount Pleasant was diverse at that time. He attended Alice Deal, which was mostly junior high school, which was mostly Black at that time. And during those summer years, attending Alice Deal, he worked in an orphanage in Honduras that in some ways planted the seeds for the creation of Oye, which wouldn't exist without Dunbarton's support. He worked with Ana Luisa Ahern, and I see Patrick on the call, to found Oye. Really, the germination for this idea came during those summers spent in Honduras. And while he was in Dunbarton, in addition to being exposed to John Wesley, he was also at Dunbarton when the church became a sanctuary church, a reconciling church. Floyd was his sponsor, mentor,
There we go.
Oh, that's neat.
and inspiration. I don't know if Floyd's on the call, but Floyd was a critical person who had a big influence on him. He went to high school, he went to school without walls, he played every sport, spent more time on sports than he did in the library, clearly. He attended University of Massachusetts at Amherst, still in public education, spent his junior year in Salamanca. After graduation, he spent 3 years living in El Progreso, getting Oye off the ground. He and Ana Luisa lived there for at least three or 4 years, getting Oye started. He loves to travel, and he and his brother took off for 14 months by bus, traveling throughout Latin America, and wrote a blog about it. That was his youthful, that was an adventure he remembers very fondly. He fell in love with Brazil, where he lived for another year working for an environmental NGO and learned Portuguese. He went to Columbia for grad school after the admissions people looked more closely at Oye than his GRE and his grades. Dev equity, the development is where it's an impact investment where he works now, where he is the impact manager. So he gets to travel all the time. Right now he is in Cartagena. His mom and I love being his parents. Thank you. Justin, take it away.
All right, Papa Joe, thank you for that warm introduction. What a treat to see so many familiar faces on this call this morning. I guess we can just dive right into it, right? Shirley, shall we? We have a little PowerPoint with some images, and we're gonna kind of guide our discussion with some basic, there we go. Can everyone see that?
Yes, very good.
Great. Okay, so this morning, I'm gonna be sharing a little bit about, well, what it was like growing up as a teenager in the 1990s DC. I'm gonna be talking a little bit about race, about inequality, about drugs and gangs, and general urban survival tactics for a young, unsure, pretty innocent kid growing up in a big city. And so I'll be telling a little bit about some stories along the way, and just kind of sharing my own stories of what it was like growing up in Mount Pleasant, Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. Okay, so the setting, Mount Pleasant, early 1990. This is kind of what the scene I was emerging upon. Today we're going to talk a little bit about youth Latino gangs. We're going to talk about neighborhood dynamics and stories of a white guy growing up in a mostly Black and Latino neighborhood. Most of my experiences growing up, race played, as it does today, to this day, an instrumental role in kind of discovering your identity and navigating this neighborhood. So I'm going to show a brief video to kind of set the table here, so we get a sense of what was going on in Mount Pleasant in the early 90s, and some context as to what a young Justin would have been seeing around him.
One of those realities was Washington's growing Latino community.
You really began to see the emergence of whole blocks and neighborhoods beginning to see Latinos from lots of different parts of Central America, mostly Salvadorians, but also Guatemalans and Nicaraguans.
Refugees from America had been settling in Washington since the early 80s.
And so you had a large number of people that left the family and had come to look for jobs so that they could send money home.
Many of the new arrivals settled in D.C.'s Adams Morgan and Mount Pleasant neighborhoods.
You have a large community in a relatively small space, very new to this society, very new to this culture.
Over time, tensions grew.
Coming from places of violence, the experience with law enforcement is very different.
Don't do that, man.
Law enforcement here had very few officers that spoke Spanish, so communication was a very significant issue.
On Cinco de Mayo, 1991, tensions finally came to a head.
It was around 7:30, and police were attempting to arrest 3 men for drinking in public at 17th and Lamont. The official police version is that one of the men resisted arrest, pulled away from a female officer, and he then came lunging at her with a knife.
There are many different stories about versions about what happened. He had a knife, didn't have a knife. Ultimately, she took out her gun and shot him. And he was injured, not killed.
The word that was spread through the community was that he was shot while he was handcuffed.
La mujer policía alta, morena, le puso la pistola aquí y disparó.
And he shot him. So it didn't take much. It was a powder keg.
There's a second part of the video, but we can skip. There you go. Thanks. That's right.
And you had 3 days of riots that caught a brand new administration totally by surprise.
Well, I think that we have a troubled community here, and I think that there are things we can do on an immediate basis, as well as long-term basis, to come to grips with it.
During the second night of rioting, Mayor Pratt imposed a curfew.
It was difficult to contain it because there was so much built-up anger. That's when I decided we have to have the curfew and see if we can have a moment to get cooler heads and get some buy-in from the leadership.
And in spite of the riots, the Latino community thrived.
I think the riots in some ways really gave us an opportunity to begin to raise up a new leadership.
The Mount Pleasant riots were a grow-up moment for the city. And it recognized that there are people in the city that were not being seen, let alone heard, or having services for. It should not take riots to change things. But when people are not heard, then you can expect something will happen to make them be heard.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that video. Okay, so a young Justin emerged on the scene in a city, in a neighborhood rife with racial tension, right? Everywhere you looked. And here you have a picture of Mount Pleasant and our neighborhood, our front stoop. And the neighbors directly adjacent to our home were the Parsons. The Parsons probably had about 4 generations living under one roof, and the young Parson boys, the three young men that are about 6 years older than me, basically ran the neighborhood. So you know, every day there'd be 10, 15 guys kind of hanging out in front of the house. And you can imagine, you know, our family coming home from a late dinner party, 3 kids. You know, we'd park on the street and excuse us, and we kind of have to navigate through this group of guys to get into our house. And, you know, this ended up being a blessing in disguise for us as we grew older, because throughout our childhood and our upbringing, little did we know that all the neighborhood guys had seen us come in and out of this house, had laid eyes on my sister Anna, my brother David, and myself. And to some extent, we were protected, right? We walked around and we had a sense of security because people knew we were from the neighborhood. We lived right next door to kind of like the main boss of the neighborhood. And so, you know, one story is Jojo and his gang, all the local youths used to sell drugs in front of the corner store. And one tactic that these guys do when they sell drugs is they never keep drugs on their person. They always have it hidden somewhere nearby. And when someone comes to buy some, they send a younger child, usually, you know, 13, 14, a runner, to run into the alley and to get whatever has just been purchased. Now, use the runner because they're minors, and if anything happens, they won't go to jail, essentially. And on more than one occasion, I think my mother found these stashes in her begonias in the back alley. and you know, I'm sure, you know, with her gardening gloves, prepping for spring, and discovered some paper bags with some stashes in there, surely. You know, this is all alley life. DC is very unique because we have alleys. And alleys create kind of like a secondary network that run throughout the city. And if you knew how to manage the alleys, you could get anywhere in the city and be out of sight. You could go from alley to alley and essentially be a ghost moving about the city. And so, you know, this neighborhood protection that we were so fortunate to have extended to my family as well. On more than one occasion, my cousin Carlos Lemos, who also grew up in Dumbarton, he did karate at Bancroft Elementary down the street, and every day Caco would have to walk from his neighborhood, Adams Morgan, to my neighborhood, Mount Pleasant. Now, as you'll hear, moving from neighborhood to neighborhood was sometimes a precarious activity. And on more than one occasion, Caco now comments that you know, he would be walking through and a group of youth, young guys would kind of surround him and want to maybe rob him or check his pockets for some loose change. And someone from the group would raise up their arm and say, no, not that kid. He's cool. That guy's cool. They had seen Caco come in and out of our home so much, they kind of knew he was an extension of our family. And the neighborhood guys had seen him. He never knew who it was saving him, but on more than one occasion, someone in the group basically, vetoed the activity, and Carlos skipped away off to karate class. And so, these are some of the stories we share today that maybe we didn't share back then. We didn't kind of recognize the uniqueness of it. But the Parsons and our experience living next door to them really allowed for us to grow up in a loved and cared for environment. And we had nothing but positive, beautiful experiences in this neighborhood. Even though there was chaos going on around us, DC was the murder capital of the United States. We were surrounded by love, and as unsavory as some of these characters may seem, when you would speak to them one-on-one, you would realize that a lot of it is bravado and a coping mechanism for handling the world around them. And deep down, they really are caring, good people. So this is the framing is Mount Pleasant, the Parsons next door. We can go on to the next slide. And so, as I mentioned, walking from neighborhood to neighborhood, depending on which neighborhood you were walking through, you would pass through a number of youth gangs. And as soon as you got off the bus, you would have to store away a few things.
I'm going to turn this off.
You were probably walking.
Justin, let's. Is the problem with I don't know, at Martha's End, or do we know? Justin, we'll ask you to continue, because it looks like everybody is.
Sure. Yeah, I heard the noise as well. Looks like we're good to go again. Yeah, if everyone is on mute, sometimes it helps. So okay, so diving back into it. So these are some of the items I would hide as soon as I would get off the bus in Columbia Heights and do about a 4-block walk to my home. I had the route mapped out in my head. I knew exactly where the groups of guys would be hanging out on the corners, and I knew which routes to take at what time of the evening to avoid these groups of youth gangs. So number one, your bus transfer. As soon as you got off the bus, someone would be there asking for your bus transfer so that they could take the bus for free somewhere else. So if you needed your bus transfer, you would have to hide it, because usually they would give it to you as you're getting off the bus and tell them you forgot to ask for one. The Walkman was one of the most coveted items of a young teenager's world. And again, the Walkman is for listening on the bus. As soon as you got off the bus and you're walking home, stash it in your backpack, or you might lose it. And then lastly, any money you had, habitually, we used to carry everything in our sock. So we would carry, our $5 bill in our sock. And this was kind of a best practice for moving about the city, carrying your few dollars in your sock. This is because inevitably you would come across 2 or 3 guys that would size you up and decide to pat you down. So put you up against the wall, pat you down, and check your pockets for change. And if you had it in your sock, you had a 50% better chance of getting away. Okay, next slide. So DCPS was a true melting pot. You were forced to recognize other cultures, other ways of life, not just your own. And this experience combined and coupled with, growing up in Dumbarton. Here you have a picture of confirmation with Annalisa. Here you have Sunday school, the Lingenbachs, Michelle. Here you have Elizabeth, David, Lars, Laura, Tomasco, Stu, and Ann and Francis Stevens. And, growing up in Dumbarton, as Joe mentioned, a reconciled congregation, I think, just framed what we're seeing today, and today's world, being able to accept one another, being able to accept, people's sexuality, people's race, basically allowing people to live their lives however they see best, is a really important characteristic, I think, in today's world. And that tone was set by Dumbarton. You mentioned Floyd. Yeah, Carlos and Floyd were some of my best friends. I remember growing up in Dumbarton, and it just seemed normal to me. They were my friends, and so as you get older, you kind of put all this into perspective. But I can't say enough about growing up in Dumbarton and how it shaped my perspectives on life today. Next slide. And undoubtedly, I'm a proud DC public school graduate, right? From elementary to junior high to high school. I've been surrounded by people from all parts of the world. And one of the most important decisions a young person makes is who they surround themselves with, who their friends are going to be. And I'm lucky. I have a band of brothers. We all grew up in DC. We all wear our DC pride on our sleeve. We go out in groups, and we all take care of each other and look out for each other. Here you see in the upper right a group of guys that are in the small photo below as well. So we're all grown up and we all still hang out. And here you have my School at Walls High School reunion. You'll hear a little more about the white guy on the basketball team here coming up. All right, next slide. All right, my basketball diaries. So, as a young boy in a big city, you're constantly searching for an identity. And some kids find that identity in a gang. Some kids are skateboarders. Some kids are, comic books. My passion and survival tactic was the basketball court. The local blacktop is where everyone is, from the time school lets out to the time the street lights go on. It's where people go to be seen. It's where you earn your name. It's where you get to represent yourself in this neighborhood. So I played in the DCPS basketball league, which DCPS back then was a mostly Black and Latino, but mostly Black school league. And so I was one of the few white guys in the league. Bless his heart, my dad used to come to every game, and whether it's down in Southeast at Ballou or Eastern, I would look up in the stands during warmups and I'd scan the faces, and there would be a glowing white guy up in the stands, and I know everyone around him knew who he was there cheering for, right? They put 2 and 2 together. They said, this guy has got to be that kid's dad. And so, growing up playing in these basketball leagues, it's a constant effort to prove yourself. And so early on, I was given the affectionate nickname of White Chocolate in my neighborhood, which I was very proud of at the time, and gave me an identity that I felt kind of accepted by the neighborhood. In one instance, we were playing at Coolidge High School, which is over in Northwest, not too far from Fort Totten. And I think we were losing by about 30. And I was sitting on the bench, and the whole arena starts chanting, "Put the white guy in, put the white guy in." Well, I look down the bench, and at that exact moment, my coach looks down, and we kind of lock eyes, and he calls me over, and I stand up, and I'm going to go in the game, and the crowd starts cheering. And sure enough, I check into the game. I'm the point guard, so I immediately receive the ball. I turn and fire off a deep 3-pointer that goes in, and the crowd goes wild. We lost by about 40 points, but it certainly made for a funny ride home with Dad. So this is just part of finding your identity. And these are some of my fondest memories is playing on these blacktops with all these guys.
Oh, this was at 11, but it's at 10.
Next slide.
Justin. What?
So you missed it.
Well, I'm catching it now.
The presentation. I'm sorry. Can everyone still hear me?
Yes, we're fine.
Yes. Great. Okay. So let's dive into the next slide. So this is kind of my basketball diaries. This, that gave me my identity. Looking ahead to kind of the youth gangs in DC at the time, as you saw in the short video, the civil wars of Central America, of specifically El Salvador, to some extent Nicaragua, Guatemala, resulted in a massive influx of refugees, of immigrants that settled in Washington, D.C. In speaking to them, they say no, they didn't go to California or the West Coast because the Mexicans weren't very friendly towards them. And so everyone went kind of east and settled in DC. Now, this resulted in a whole generation of young men brought to the United States with their moms, in most cases, living in single parent households and thrust upon a city that was, 85% Black. And so suddenly you have all these Latino youth having to interact and find their place in a city that, in a chocolate city, right? And so, the 90s in particular, it was a pretty rough time in DC. And so I'm going to talk a little bit just about the dynamics of those gangs, the gang life in DC. I had a lot of friends in gangs, and I grew up interacting with all the gangs. I was friends with them. Thankfully, I look white, and so I was never recruited or harassed by gangs. I was neutral. I was a neutral. I could be friends with the Black gangs. I could be friends with the Latino gangs. And so to some extent, I was safe, and I could, hang out at the blacktop and play basketball with all the Black guys, and then go up and talk to the Latino guys. And there was, no ill will. So I was very fortunate with that in the neighborhood. But if we go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just gang structure. The Black gangs in DC are turf related. They're neighborhood related. For example, you see 1-7, 1-4. These were gangs that represented the street they lived on, 14th Street, 17th Street. And the Black gangs were all about turf and selling drugs. And so they had a system designed to move drugs, to distribute. On early mornings, I would go out and walk my dog, my Labrador K, and I would be out at 6 a.m. and I'd see Jojo, our neighbor, and 30 guys in the alley, and he would be distributing their packages for the day. And I would walk out with Kay and give a nod and go on my way, and they would be at 6 a.m. having a neighborhood meeting and organizing themselves. So the Black gangs were structured this way. Whereas the Latino gangs were more about pride. They came from a deeper structure, from the MS-13 structure, and they had a recruitment system, and they weren't selling drugs. They were basically just trying to identify and pledge allegiance to a specific gang. So, for example, if you had some of the gangs that come to mind are La R, which is La Raza. You had BU, which was Brown Union. And so whenever you had an adult gang, when an adult, I say, 18 to 20-year-olds, 17 to 20-year-olds, you had a smaller gang. So if you had Brown Union, you had Little Brown Union, which were the junior high school kids, which were the kids that were being recruited to the gang. So every adult gang member had a protege that they were bringing up in the ranks. So if you had one guy named Barney in Brown Union, you had Little Barney in Little Brown Union. And so this is kind of the way it worked. And you always had in older elder statesmen in the older gangs that would that would bring you along and send you on missions, and you would kind of prove your worth. And so here you see a picture of Ronaldo with his cleats around his neck. This was one of my survival tactics. I would get off the bus late because I would be playing soccer and soccer practice. And I knew I had to walk down Park Road from Columbia Heights to Mount Pleasant. And I knew I was going to pass 4 or 5 groups of young Latino gangs. These are the famous ninis that I mentioned in the Oye presentation. Ni trabaja ni estudia. Often aren't working or aren't studying, so they have nothing to do. And nothing is more dangerous than idle minds with nothing to do. And so one of my tactics was to pull out my soccer cleats, tie the laces, drape it around my neck, and walk down Park Road in an attempt to connect with these guys in some way. So even at the age of 13, 14, 15, I recognized that, hey, these guys probably like soccer. I like soccer too. Please don't rob me. Let me go on my way. And it seemed to have worked. But all these kind of small details of life, one, is always observing, and this is one of the life hacks I came up with. So next slide. And so I'm going to tell really quickly, Johnny. I reconnected with Johnny a few months ago after about 20 years of not seeing him, not hearing anything about him. Johnny and I grew up in Calvary in a local multicultural youth center. And so we were best friends. We used to walk home. We used to split a bag of mango every day on our walks home. And Johnny ended up going to Lincoln, which is the neighborhood school. I went to Deal and then School Without Walls. And so we would end up squaring off on the soccer field. And he was a great soccer player. And so, we would always have these clashes. And this year, when I sat with Johnny and chatted with him and we caught up, we found each other on LinkedIn. Johnny told me about high school. We talked about high school. And Johnny says, I was like, well, what was it like for you? Because for me, I was at Walls and we lost touch. He said, look, when I was at Bell, I was approached by all the gangs and they forced me to choose a gang. I'm from El Salvador. It's kind of the way it works. I wasn't allowed to just be neutral. Had to pledge my allegiance to one of the gangs. And Johnny, who now is a serial entrepreneur and he's developed 3 or 4 apps and doing quite well for himself, negotiated with the neighborhood gangs and was granted permission to form his own gang that would pledge allegiance to the gang. So Johnny and I's fist fights after school, and with the main gangs looking on, and he would recruit the winners of these fist fights to his gang, and they didn't have to respond to the big gangs. They could be their own gang. And so Johnny basically created his own gang to avoid having to deal with the chaos that comes with joining some of these bigger gangs, which usually includes a lot of tattoos at a young age, getting into trouble, jumping other kids. So Johnny just told this amazing story about how he was able to negotiate with the Latino gangs who were forcing him to, step up and join one of them. And he formed his own gang and basically negotiated his independence. And so I was just blown away by his stories, when we met this year. And I was just really came to the realization of the different worlds we lived in. Here I was, in a loving whole family. I had my dad, I had my mom, I was surrounded by love. And here was Johnny, my best friend, from a single parent household, basically fighting for his life every day after school, and trying to make do and basically strictly based on his roots. He's a Latino, and this is the way the neighborhood worked. If you were a black kid, you would be pressured to join one of the local gangs. And me and my group of misfit friends who you saw the photo above, we're all kind of the outliers. We didn't get into any trouble. We didn't join any gangs, and we all banded together. And for the most part, we're left alone and just had a wonderful, wonderful upbringing in this neighborhood. And so, next slide. And we'll leave a little bit of time for a Q&A. It'd be nice to just talk a little bit about some of your experiences. So, settling down, this is the Tivoli on 14th Street. This is what it looked like when I used to walk by every day after soccer practice on the left here. And so I remember coming home from UMass one summer and basically said, Mom, wow, where did all these white people come from? There were white people all over the neighborhood. And one of the main kind of indicators I noticed for kind of increased safety was people walking around with headphones on, listening to music. And that sense of security that you could just walk around and no one's going to creep up behind you. And when your headphones are on, you're kind of oblivious to what's going on around you. Typically walking around, you want to keep your wits about you. You want to keep your head on a swivel. You want to be on the lookout. But when I started seeing people walking around with headphones on, I knew something was up. Something was a little. And so slowly but surely, kind of every year, the neighborhood continued to change. And for the most part, I think Northwest DC is among the most gentrified regions in the United States. And if you look at the price of the income levels and property costs, a lot of these families that lived in these row houses, in some cases didn't have reliable or stable income, and in some cases accrued a lot of property tax. And so when speculators and some of these realtors came in, they would call that property tax, and that family would realize they owed $20,000 in property tax, which they didn't have, and they would be forced to sell. So just mismanagement and really, having dysfunction in some cases really led to a lot of families having to move out pretty quickly. And so from one year to the next, slowly, all my friends started to disappear. They all moved out to Maryland and Virginia, and their homes were sold and renovated. And so with this comes good and bad, like everything in life. Schools improved, the roads improved. Food deserts now have Whole Foods, and so it has brought a lot of positive change with it in the neighborhood. But unfortunately, a lot of my childhood friends have not been able to participate in that. Jojo, the neighbors that looked out for me growing up, who my dad mentored, he's kind of the only father figure they had next door. Jojo and I still talk, and to this day, he just recognizes the role our family played in helping him grow as well. And so Jojo doesn't live in the neighborhood anymore. None of his friends do. They all gather in Lamont Park where they used to in the 90s, and they all bring a 6-pack of beer, and they sit there just like it was the 1990s, and they just talk, and they sit out on the stoop, and they build their own community. And so this is kind of an example of what's been going on now, the gentrification we see in DC. You can go to the next slide, the last slide, and just an example of kind of how things used to be and what things are now. This is the wall that I used to walk down, this long, treacherous wall down 14th Street, and now it's a Target, and it's got a Best Buy and everything. And I know a lot of these apartment buildings had fires, and people had to move out. And there's always a question if there was some fraud involved, but many fires that forced people to move out and allowed the landowners to renovate to high-end clientele. Argyle's, the corner store, and some apartment buildings on Mount Pleasant mysteriously had fires, and so now they're higher end condos. But this is just some stories about growing up in DC in the 90s. A young, unsure white kid surrounded by my Black friends, my Latino friends, my white friends. And I am, my mom's from Bolivia, but in the city, in the neighborhood, if you don't look Latino, you're not Latino. So, I had an Indian friend that looked very Latino. He got recruited into the gangs until they found out his parents were from India, and then they left him alone. But just sharing with y'all, a privilege to share with you just a little bit about my upbringing in DC, and and how Dumbarton and my neighborhood kind of shaped who I am, and positioned me and allowed me to just go on into the world and accept people for who they are, and really embrace everyone the way that they are. So thank you all for joining us this Sunday morning. I really appreciate it, and I'd love to just kind of hear your thoughts or any comments.
Thank you, Justin, very much. We don't have a lot of time. I'm going to ask people if you would like to put your name into chat. We would start by hearing what someone has to ask as a question. And we're possibly, Justin, going to ask if you can be responding to us offline, and that we would be able to share that information because we're a little bit short on time. I also want to mention to everybody who is here today that next week we are going to be hearing about Afghanistan from Pam Constable, who is just coming back from Afghanistan. So the latest word, even before it's possibly in the newspapers and on television and radio, we will be hearing about. So if anybody has any quick question or comment, please put it into the chat.
Shirley, will Justin's talk be recorded and put up on YouTube?
Yes, we have recorded it. We hope to put it up on YouTube. We will be mentioning this on the Dunbarton listserv, and then also in eChips next week. I had said that for starting off on our Q&A and discussion, that the first person we would hear from is a prominent Dumbartonian who happens to be Justin's mother. So Maria, ask if you have any reflection or comment that you have for right now.
Well, I would thank Justin for his presentation. And it is interesting that the adults, I think, had a very different experience that certainly he did as he was growing up. I've certainly learned a lot in this video about. My question is more for other people to be able to talk a little bit about how they saw DC during these periods of time, what they envisioned the racial changes that the city has undergone, and how that really impacts on all of our lives. I mean, our church is in Georgetown, but we go through the city to be able to get to our church. So I'm just interested in hearing from other people about their own experiences with this issue that Justin raises.
Okay, so we have that as a kind of question. I'm going to be compiling several different things. The suggestion that we compile early memories of what DC was like, especially in this period that we're talking about now in the turbulent 90s. We have a question about what you are doing now and where you are and your plans for the next few years, and a question about guns and gangs, and when did guns become a major factor in all of this. Another question about police presence in the 1990s. Justin, I'm going to say we're not going to have time to cover all of that. We're not going to be able to hear from everybody as participants, but I'm going to ask you just right now to say something about what you're doing professionally now and your immediate plans, and then we will have to end.
Sure. Yeah, as mentioned, I work with an impact investment fund. I've been doing so for about the last 8 years. We invest in sustainable, commercially viable, emerging businesses in Latin America, sustainable agribusiness, cacao, quinoa, superfoods in Peru, smallholder farmers, affordable housing. These are homes built for low-income families to get bank loans and stop renting and build some equity and buy low-income homes for them and their families. And then urban revitalization. This is restoring urban hubs and city centers in historic districts in Tegucigalpa in Honduras and Panama City. Currently, we have investments active in Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, Ecuador, and Peru.
Okay. Justin, on behalf of the whole group, I thank you very much for your presentation today. And I think you can tell that it is important to us to stay in contact with you. So thank you for your availability today. And I have to say, possibly
So much fun.
in the future. So, okay, everybody, we're going to be ending for now and hope to see you next week at 10 o'clock. And there has been the suggestion that we continue some part of this theme for a future time. So thank you all for your participation. I'm going to end the meeting.